Well, the lead story in this morning's New York Times is warning how a second term could unleash a darker Trump, highlighting the former president's violent and authoritarian rhetoric on the 2024 campaign trail. The paper notes that as he runs for president again, facing 4 criminal prosecutions, Mr. Trump may seem more angry, desperate, and dangerous to American-style democracy than in his first term. But the through line that emerges is far more long-running. He has glorified political violence and spoken admiringly of autocrats for decades. The Times points to an interview from more than 3 decades ago where Trump spoke admirably of how China crushed democratic protesters in Tiananmen Square, and also highlights his past praise for former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein and Philippine strongman Rodrigo Duterte. The paper notes that in a hypothetical second Trump administration, the forces that somewhat contained his autocratic tendencies in his first term, including some staffers, congressional Republicans, and a partisan balance on the Supreme Court, would all be weaker. As a result, Mr. Trump's and his advisors' more extreme policy plans and ideas for a second term would have a greater prospect of becoming a reality.
Let's bring in right now staff writer for The Atlantic, Ann Applebaum, her new piece, part of The Atlantic special issue outlining the dangers of a potential second term for Donald Trump, is titled Trump Will Abandon NATO. Ann, thanks so much for being with us. The New York Times lead, written by Charlie Savage, Jonathan Swan, and Maggie Haberman. It's much like a piece that the Washington Post has recently written, and also what's happening with The Atlantic this month. You, Jeffrey Goldberg, so many others writing about the dangers of a second Trump term, and again, this is all lifted straight from, I believe it was your book in 2017. It seems all of your warnings appear to be taking shape in the form of Donald Trump's plans for a second term.
I think people are suddenly realizing that Trump is very likely to be the Republican candidate. And I think they're also realizing just about now that he is running on an explicitly anti-constitutional platform. He's running as someone who would overthrow the Constitution, who would undermine it, who would, undermine the American civil service, maybe the military. And I think that's why you're suddenly seeing so many people writing about it. In fact, your previous item, we're already having a taste of what a Trump second term could look like in this battle, really irresponsible battle over funding for Ukraine. Here is an ally who we've been supporting bravely for the last 19 months. They are fighting on the ground. They are undermining the army of one of our important geopolitical rivals, Russia. And we're arguing in Washington about whether or not to keep helping them. I mean, that's outrageous, but it's a taste of what could happen if Trump were to win, in which case he's very likely to say, I don't care about Europe. I don't care about NATO. I'm leaving.
So Ann, as you studied in your book, as you studied what Orban did on the path to power, as you studied what the Law and Justice Party did on the path to power, I don't remember it even being as explicit.
Right.
Their threats against democracy in Hungary and Poland, even being as explicit as having a presidential candidate promising to terminate the Constitution, execute generals that are insufficiently loyal, and ban television news networks that he doesn't like. Again, in the campaign phase, this seems far more explicit, far more extreme than even what we saw in Orban's rise and the Law and Justice's rise in Poland.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's true that in both of those cases, it was the second term. It was the second time of being in power when those political parties and leaders, began to push back against the media, change the Constitution, change the courts. And so in that sense, this is a parallel. But you're right that this kind of language about, attacking my enemies and describing them as vermin, which is the kind of language that Nazis use to describe their enemies and describe Jews. This isn't something you heard in Central Europe. It sounds much more like what you'd hear in Russia or in one of the really severe autocracies around the world. It's not even the language of declining democracy elsewhere.
So, Ann, let's be specific on your piece about Donald Trump getting out of NATO. First of all, how that would work. What does it look like for the United States to get out of NATO? And the implications of that, given what we're living through right now in Ukraine, given President Biden's efforts to strengthen NATO, that has added members on the cusp of adding another here still, getting 800 miles of new border up along Russia with its latest member. What would it mean for the United States to withdraw from NATO? What would it mean to the world?
So first of all, it's important to understand what NATO is. NATO is an alliance based on a pretty open-ended treaty. Article 5, this famous Article 5 of the NATO treaty, just says an attack on one member will be treated as an attack on all. It doesn't say what you have to do. There's no obligation to do anything. But it has created a psychological effect. The idea is that there is something like collective defense, that the United States, plus its European allies, plus Canada, would come to one another's aid if attacked. And it did happen once. After 9/11, there was a declaration of Article 5, and NATO members came to U.S. aid in Afghanistan. But what that means is that if Trump were to be president, and if he were simply to say, I don't believe in collective defense anymore, I don't care about Europe, which he has said, by the way. He said, I don't give a shit about NATO to John Bolton. He tried to leave the NATO alliance a couple of times when he was president before. If he were to say that, and if he were to be backed up by his cabinet members, that's it, because the promise of collective defense is gone. And there would, of course, be a reaction. The Senate would fight back, and, former, military chiefs, and there might be political, resistance to it. But really, all he has to do is say it. And then if people just don't believe he would go to war for them anymore, then why wouldn't Russia say, oh, okay, if that's how it is, then, why should we defend Poland U.S. isn't going to defend Poland if we attack, the airports that are being used to bring in Ukrainian aid. And so it would simply create the impression that collective defense is gone. And by the way, that would have an impact in Taiwan and South Korea as well.